Paul's epistle to the Philippians overflows with effervescent joy and sparkles with the delight of family affections. It's a letter that's designed to be encouraging and refreshing by reminding readers of the magnificence of Christ and their common joy in Christ. This letter derives from a period when Paul was in captivity in, we will argue, Ephesus. While in chains, Paul contemplates the potential end of his life's work and looks ahead to what might lie in store. It shows Paul as joyful even amidst adversity. It is a mature and measured piece of writing, composed after having experienced a vicious confrontation in Antioch, after addressing the persecution and puzzlements of the Thessalonians, after rebuking the potential defections in Galatia and responding pastorally to the immorality and divisiveness of the Corinthian community. In this letter to the Philippians, Paul displays heartfelt gratitude to the Philippians, whom he regards as nothing less than his joy and crown. Indeed, this letter goes to show that Paul was a figure who remained concerned for the bonds of affection that he had with his churches, and he never ceased to be surprised at the joy which they gave him. As we look at Philippians, we've got to get into the normal background information and the various debates. The city of Philippi is located in eastern Macedonia. Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, he became aware of the city's nearby silver and gold mines, so he annexed the region in 356 BC, and he renamed the city Philippi after himself. The city was a significant outpost for the border with Thrace to the east, and located as it was along the Via Egnatia, it was an important stop in the land route towards the Hellespont and even on further into Asia Minor. The city remained fairly insignificant even after the Roman conquest of Macedonia in 168-67 BC. However, in 42 BC, the plains of Philippi were the site of one of the most famous and important battles in Roman history. It was the place where the combined legions of Mark Antony and Octavian defeated the Republican forces of Brutus and Cassius, the assassins of Julius Caesar. The victors settled many of their veterans in Philippi and re-established the city as a Roman colony. More Roman veterans settled into the region after Octavian then defeated Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. In Paul's day, Philippi had a population of about 10,000, though it was somewhat dwarfed by the largest city of Thessalonica, about 150 kilometers to the west. Philippi is a good example of a Romanized Greek city. The region was settled with Roman colonists, veterans and their descendants, who enjoyed Italian legal status and certain tax exemptions, and it was also complete with the Roman system of city government. Most inscriptions in the city in the first century are in Latin, not Greek. The ruling class then were Latin in language, culturally Italian or Roman, and politically orientated towards the center of Roman power. However, the outlying areas and most local laborers and migrants were probably either Macedonian or Thracian, with immigrants coming as far as Egypt, Asia Minor, and even Judea. Greek language and culture did not disappear, but it recovered its ascendancy by the 3rd century AD. The resident religions reflect the diversity of the city, as many as 35 different deities were venerated and worshipped in Philippi. Prominent among them were the Thracian horsemen, Dionysus, Artemis, Diana, Silvanus, plus the cult to the divine Augustus. So while Greek culture did not evaporate with Roman colonization, the population was politically, culturally, and religiously very Roman. The Philippian church also had the distinction of being the first church in Europe, and it was part of the first phase of Paul's mission in Macedonia, which is in modern Greece. It marks Paul's move away from cities with a very significant Jewish population, like those in Asia Minor, to cities that were essentially Gentile and pagan, if you like, in both religion and culture. It was here that Paul saw a whole new beginning of the gospel in Europe. Sometime around 50 AD, Paul and his co-workers, including Silas, left Troas in Asia Minor and arrived at the port town of Neapolis, and then took the 15-mile walk to Philippi. Luke records several events which transpired during Paul's time in the city. These include the conversion of Lydia, a Gentile God-fearer, originally from Thyatira, who traded in the valuable product of purple cloth. Paul also conducted an exorcism of a fortune-telling slave girl. When the spirit of divination left her, so did her powers, and her owners were so enraged that they had Paul and Silas dragged before the local authorities. Paul and Silas were beaten and imprisoned on order of the Philippian officials. Luke also records an earthquake that opened the prison doors where they were locked up, and how the Philippian jailer was converted and welcomed Paul and Silas into his own home. Paul made it known to the Philippian magistrates that he and Silas were Roman citizens, and requested that they personally escort them from the prison, to which they apologetically complied. Luke's narrative of Paul's imprisonment is impossible to verify, but largely corresponds with Paul's report that, he says, we had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi. In regards to the letter's provenance, it's traditionally been asserted that Paul wrote Philippians from Rome, while others have suggested Caesarea or Ephesus as the place of composition. We prefer a setting in Ephesus with the date in the early to mid-50s for several reasons. First, we know that Paul spent considerable periods of time in Ephesus. Not only that, but an Ephesian imprisonment is a sound deduction based on Luke's report of Paul's tumultuous time in the city. Plus, we have Paul's own reference to the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. And we have his enigmatic remarks about how I fought wild beasts at Ephesus. That's all suggestive of him facing an imprisonment, maybe even a capital trial in Ephesus. Second, Paul's travel plans cannot be squared with the composition of the captivity letters, that's Philippians, Ephesians, Philemon, and Colossians, from Rome. We know from Romans that Paul was hoping to travel to Spain after passing through Rome. Yet he told Philemon to prepare a guest room for him as he hoped to visit him in Colossia in the Lycus Valley. If we place Philippians and Philemon in Rome, as many do, then it would be a violently circuitous route to travel, as Paul proposes, from Rome to Spain in the west via the middle of Asia Minor in the east. It's a pretty strange journey. However, if we locate these two letters in an Ephesian imprisonment, that's Philippians and Philemon, then the incongruity is seemingly removed, as a trip to Colossia from Ephesus is manageable, as is any correspondence between Ephesus and Philippi. It's just across the Aegean Sea. Third, Timothy is the co-author of Philippians, yet we have no solid evidence that Timothy accompanied Paul to Rome, and he more likely remained in Ephesus, where the pastoral epistles, assuming their authenticity or something like that, place him. 4. The claim that Paul's reference to the Praetorium and the saints of the household of Caesar, that implies a Roman rather than Ephesian provenance, is overstated. While it's true that Asia, that's Western Asia Minor, was a senatorial rather than imperial province, it's hardly unexpected that, given the prominence of the city of Ephesus, that an imperial residence with imperial administrators and a skeleton garrison could be found in the city. So an Ephesian provenance is more than likely. On a situation reflected in the letter, the Philippians were not a problem church. They weren't like the Corinthians. They were in a relatively healthy state compared to some of the other Pauline churches of Greece. The Philippians were undisturbed by the anxieties and idleness that affected the Thessalonians, and they did not experience the factionalism and immoralities that plagued the Corinthians. That said, the Philippians were not without their own struggles. The Philippians, like the other churches of Macedonia, had undergone persecution and hardship, and were experiencing the same struggles that Paul had known. In addition, Paul is concerned that there is a group who might arrive in Philippi, and their message would be something like to announce the superiority of their inherited privileges as Jews and try to urge the Gentile believers to be circumcised, and that they could put confidence in the flesh. Again, it's hard to determine if Paul thinks that such persons had already arrived in Philippi, or whether he was more concerned that such persons might one day make it to Philippi. In addition, Paul informs the addressees of his intention to send Timothy to them. And he recounts Epaphroditus' illness and the aptness of returning him to Philippi. Along with that, Paul explains how he hopes to be released from imprisonment and to visit Philippi again. Paul also uses the letter as an opportunity to offer some counsel to the strained relationships between Euodia and Syntyche, who are among his co-workers, and the letter itself makes several exhortations towards unity. But the principal occasion for the letter lies with Paul's desire to thank the Philippians for the financial support arriving through Epaphroditus and to acknowledge their generosity with affectionate and warm language. The chief critical issue discussed in relation to Philippians is that of its integrity. The issue is whether Philippians is really one letter or a composite of 2 or 3 different letters that have been stitched together. The claim is sometimes made that the transition from Philippians 3:1 to 3:2 is so terribly abrupt, as if the end of one letter at 3:1 has had a Pauline exhortation, that's 3:2 to 21, another letter, artificially inserted onto it as a secondary attachment. Furthermore, Philippians 4:10 to 20 is said to be an independent letter of thanksgiving attached to an evolving catalogue of Paul's Philippian correspondence. Now that's the idea, but there's several problems with it, with the composite letter hypothesis. First, there is a lack of literary precedence for such a practice in the world of ancient letter collections, which leaves a huge question mark over the plausibility of such literary manipulation. Second, if the editors of a Philippian or Pauline letter collection felt free to unite 2 or 3 letters into a single one, then you've got to wonder why they did not feel free to make the transition between the seams smoother. It still remains very, very abrupt and very clunky. Third, we also have to wonder why anyone would feel the need to compile Pauline letters in this fashion, when the Pauline collection was more than capable of sustaining medium and shorter sized letters together sent out to general locations or to individuals, as is the case with Colossians and Philemon. Fourth, it's not difficult to imagine why Philippians takes the shape that it does, ebbing and flowing between exhortation and what seem to be final remarks, especially if Paul's train of thought kept changing or if he composed or dictated the letter over a number of days.
Paul's letter to the church in Philippi celebrates a joyful partnership, the many-layered fellowship, koinonia, between Paul and the first church in Europe. Sharing as they did in the Messiah's love at a deep level, they had also entered into partnership at the practical level of resources. Paul was in prison. They had sent Epaphroditus to him with a gift of money, but Epaphroditus had become ill on the journey and so had delayed his return. So Paul writes to thank them for the money and to assure them, warding off any suspicions, that their messenger has been faithful to his commission. The letter is therefore joyful, and Paul is determined that his own uncertain future in prison, will he be facing the death penalty, he's not sure, will not detract from this. As far as he's concerned anyway, his imprisonment has brought the gospel to public attention, and Jesus, he says, will be glorified whatever the outcome. He himself will be content, confident that if he dies, he will be with the Messiah, which will be far better, but that if he remains alive, it'll be because he has fruitful work to do. All this forms a foundation for Paul to go into more detail about his hopes and prayers for the church in Philippi. His concern, as so often, was for the church to maintain its public witness in face of misunderstanding and hostility. Opponents will be everywhere, not least when a small group believes that Jesus is Lord in a place like Philippi, a Roman colony, committed to the belief that Caesar was Lord. So trouble will come, but the church must link arms and celebrate the victory of Jesus in a hard-won unity and a costly holiness. Paul carefully frames this appeal for unity and holiness around what has become a famous poem, The poem itself is found in chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, with 6 three-line stanzas and the all-important single line in the middle. The first half tells of the descent of the one who was always in God's form, always equal with God, but who humbled himself to become human and to die the death of a disgraced slave. The 5 verses before the poem, 2:1-5, appeal for unity. The 7 verses afterwards, 2:12-18, appeal for holiness. Paul can only say a very little in a letter. His hearers have got to work out for themselves what this salvation is going to mean in practice. That's what he says in chapter 2, verse 12. And for that, they need the Messiah's mind. Have this mind among you, he says, which is yours because you are in the Messiah Jesus. There is then a brief paragraph about Timothy and another brief paragraph about Epaphroditus. And that leads us to what looks as though it was going to be a conclusion, but there is more. After all, conditions in prison may not have favored fluent dictation. The break that we observe between Philippians chapter 2 and Philippians chapter 3 seems awkward and jerky to us, but that does not undermine the deeper unity of the letter as a whole. Chapter 3 is indeed closely linked to chapters 1 and 2. Paul tells his own story as a model for what it means to have the Messiah's mind, showing how he abandoned his own apparent privileges as a loyal Jew in order to gain the ultimate prize, the Messiah himself and his resurrection. Philippians then is all about learning to think messianically and to let that thinking inform every aspect of life. That's how the Philippian church, like Paul, will have strength for everything in the one who gives me power.
It is no wonder that Paul's letter to the Philippians is a cherished book for many, with the majestic heights of its Christology, its call to imitate Jesus and Paul, the pursuit of godly virtues, and the promotion of the gospel. As we read over Philippians, there are some challenging things for us to focus on, and I'll only mention a few. I'll mention fellowship, citizenship, and humility. First, one can scarcely avoid noticing how the theme of fellowship looms large in this letter. The problem is, though, that most Christians, when they think of fellowship, they think of it as a kind of churchy version of friendship. How many times have you heard someone say, hang around after the service for fellowship over a cup of coffee? If we take Philippians as our guide, though, fellowship is not what you do over coffee in your church, but something your church does with the missionaries it supports. Our churches are called to have a fellowship in the gospel that will entail giving and receiving from gospel workers, local and overseas, to promote the advance of the gospel. Paul gives huge props to the Philippians because of their fellowship with him in this gospel, since from the very beginnings of his Macedonian mission, they've been supporting him. It is a fellowship which continues even while he suffers in prison. As anyone working for an aid agency or missionary organization will tell you, there is no mission without margin. The noble work of such groups will always be dependent upon the generosity of individuals and churches who wish to have genuine fellowship with those men and women working hard on the front lines of kingdom ministries. That should not lead to paternalism, but to genuine partnership, a mutual giving and receiving, a commitment to achieve shared goals from shared resources. It is such giving that Paul says is a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice pleasing to God. The budgets of all churches must find a place to put something on the altar of sacrificial worship in order to facilitate fellowships in the gospel that are fruitful on earth as they are beautiful in heaven. Second, when Paul says that our citizenship is in heaven, he's not trying to increase our hope of going there as much as stressing that Christ, who reigns in heaven, will one day return from heaven, and he is the object of our hope and the unrivaled recipient of our loyalty. There's nothing specifically wrong with being a citizen of a country like Rome, just as there's nothing wrong with being a British, American, or Australian citizen. But when the gospel of Jesus is unveiled, it reveals the true empire, the true citizenship, the true Lord. And in that light, all the pretensions of empire, not least the arrogant and blasphemous claims of the emperor himself, or the propaganda of power-hungry presidents wherever they are, they're all exposed as folly. I keep hearing that the church is on the wrong side of history on so many issues. That is at best a half-truth. I think it's truer to say that the church has always been on the wrong side of empire. The church's vocation is not to bless on cue the power, policies, and pantheon of civic leaders, but to measure them by the standards of Christ, to pursue things that make for peace and justice, and to proclaim that all will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. The church was never intended to be the religious department of any empire, but always an alternative to empire, building for the kingdom, setting up an embassy for the one true Lord, living lives according to his symbols, his teaching, his story, and no other. Thus, Paul is really warning the Philippians not to compromise their allegiance to Jesus and to be prepared by refusing to take part in cultic and other activities to follow their Messiah along the path of suffering. They should do that whilst knowing that Jesus, the one true Lord, will rescue them and give them the only glory worth possessing. In the same way, the church today must be prepared to resist any practices or pledges that authorities demand of the church as a token to our subservience to the political establishment or to the cultural elites of the day. The church's loyalty cannot be auctioned off to those who promise to give it political influence, nor can its core convictions be pummeled into submission to fit with the reigning ideologies and philosophies of the day. For the citizens of heaven, the gospel should be declared, not domesticated. It should not be watered down to win the favor of political demagogues, nor compromised to gain inclusion at the pool of popularity. Third, a major part of Paul's exhortation focuses on the theme of humility. His emphasis on humility looms large in Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 to 5, and it's the centerpiece of the Christ poem in chapter 2, verses 7 to 8. It's important to stress that humility was not a virtue in the ancient world. Humility was regarded as weakness, civility, and self-abasement. It was for inferiors and slaves who had been kicked down the bottom rungs of society. The pursuit of honor and fame, usually over the backs of others, is what the pagans prized, at least as reflected in their literature and social practices. But the radical and crazy thing is that Paul says that humility is precisely what followers of the Messiah are to embrace, because he himself embraced the lowest form of humility possible, obedience to death on the cross. That is the road that Jesus walked, and believers must walk it too if they are to follow him. That is why the Christ poem of Philippians 2 is so important. Yes, the poem has a Christology that is so high that if it were a mountain, you could see another mountain called Nicaea directly adjacent to it. But the thrust of the poem is to tell a story that is to become the pattern and paradigm of true discipleship. Self-giving, not self-seeking. I'm sure you've heard the saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish and you feed him for life. In a similar way, we could proffer this saying, give a man a command and you order him about for a day. But tell a man a story and you change his life. Paul is more than capable of giving commands and orders. He does, after all, want their obedience. He offers dozens of exhortations, and he wants them to follow his example. But most of all, he wants them to absorb the story of Jesus, specifically the story of his death, his self-giving humility, so that story habitually expresses itself in their relationships amongst themselves, even within the wider world. Paul's goal is for the Philippians to adopt a form of moral reasoning that is shaped by the story of Jesus as the bedrock of their single-minded unity. It is when the story of Jesus becomes their own story that the rivalries and hostilities among them, like those between Euodia and Syntyche, will find a peaceable resolution. Instead of carrying grudges against each other, they should carry their cross together.